Hello, in this webinar, we'll cover the risks relevant to AWS your organization needs to consider when undergoing a SOC 2 audit. Before we get started, I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Andrew Stansfield. I'm a senior security consultant with LBMC Information Security. I work in our IT assurance practice and primarily serve in our SOC and high trust service lines. So setting the theme of the presentation here, switching from on-prem data center that's hosting your systems does not completely mitigate risks associated with that data. It merely changes where those risks are. If your information is resting in the cloud, it's somebody else's environment at the end of the day, and in this case, it's going to be AWS's. And so it's helpful for going through a SOC to identify where those responsibility lies, whether it's the organization being assessed or it's AWS's responsibility. And it is a mixture between those two. So AWS has published their shared responsibility model here. This outlines who's responsible for what in general terms for AWS versus the user of the AWS resources. So while the backend infrastructure is generally AWS's responsibility, and the applications and the operating systems and various other configurations are going to be the responsibility of the organization utilizing AWS. And this matrix may change depending on the specific services we're using. For instance, if we're using a AWS instance to host the application itself, then maybe the backend infrastructure isn't in scope. Whereas if we're using AWS to host the backend infrastructure that the application is running on, then both the infrastructure and the application would be the user of AWS's responsibility. But it is a good starting point to kind of sift through and identify who's responsible for what. So some key terms we want to call out here that may be referenced throughout the presentation is these are some common services. EC2 is AWS's equivalent of a virtual machine. AWS is going to be responsible for the hypervisor the virtual servers running on, but the entity utilizing EC2 is responsible for the host that makes up EC2. S3 is a containerized file system within AWS. It essentially is buckets where information can be stored. So if you hear the term S3 buckets, it's just a file system within AWS. It's very robust, and it is a common resource we see utilized within AWS. So ECS and EKS, these are platforms for running serverless applications in AWS. This takes out a lot of the backend infrastructure. The organization utilizing ECS or EKS won't have the responsibility for managing the infrastructure side of the application. CloudWatch and CloudTrail are both monitoring services in AWS. One deals a little more with capacity, and the other one's a little more with security and access. CloudWatch being that geared more towards capacity, and CloudTrail being geared more towards it's pulling all API calls to the management console itself. And so Lambda, this is serverless computing in AWS. It's based on triggers. So you define something that you want to happen based on a trigger. When the trigger happens, it kicks off code that runs and computes whatever you need. So we're going to go through the different trust service criterias and identify where AWS plays a role in controls that would need to be implemented when having systems in AWS. So to start with security, access management plays a large part in CC6 in a SOC 2 type 2 report. So with that, a very key part of access management as it relates to AWS is the AWS management console itself. Within the AWS management console, there's a lot of risks around being able to manage the resources we're using, both from a asset inventory standpoint of being able to spin up and remove resources, as well as access information stored in say file systems like S3, or modifying applications that are running out of AWS. As such, you would expect similar controls such as multi-factor authentication, provisioning and deprovisioning of users, and user access reviews, and how we manage all those controls. We would expect those to be applied to the AWS management console. A big risk here is permissions within the management console are defined by policies within AWS that are applied to users and roles. And the customer, the entity being assessed, has the ability to create their own policies. And while this is helpful for enforcing least privilege to certain resources. It can create some unintended privileged access if they aren't crafted carefully. And so there's a lot of risk around who has access to the management console based on, it's hosting all of your resources in your environment. If everything's in AWS, then the management console is that central piece that's controlling it. So that is a critical piece to look at for access management. As far as resource management goes, this ties in with CC6 as well. Resources in AWS is that shared responsibility. And so the organization is responsible for managing the host that is running on, say, an EC2 instance, whereas the AWS is responsible for ensuring that host has the power and the connection to the internet, and for the more the hypervisor level responsibility there. And this ties in with that shared responsibility model we looked at earlier. Logging and monitoring, this ties in with CC7. We mentioned briefly about CloudTrail and CloudWatch. These are excellent services within AWS that can be used for logging actions performed within the AWS environment. Logs from these tools can be sent to a SIEM solution for review. If we're using EC2, it's not going to pick up any logs on the host unless we have an agent on the host. And so if there's a CloudWatch agent on an EC2 instance, it can pick up Windows event logs, for instance, and send those to a SIEM in a similar way to another SIEM solution may have agents you can have on your host, and communicate logs out that way, or to whoever is going to be reviewing your logs for monitoring purposes. As far as networking goes, this ties in with CC6 as well. Networking still applies within AWS. You have ingress and egress traffic into AWS's virtual private cloud network, and these can be controlled through various configurations, such as security groups being applied to EC2 instances, which kind of act like firewalls, and then NACLs, or network access control lists. These apply more to the VPC as a whole. And so AWS also offers a WAF service for your web applications that can be helpful for showing controls applied to our networking. And change management, AWS has specific services that can be utilized for deploying code changes to applications hosted out of AWS. The big one we see is AWS Code Pipeline, and it does a lot of helpful things, such as setting up gateways as part of the steps you'd expect, such as authorizations, testing, QA approval events, those types of auditable steps along the change management path. However, an important piece here to make sure we're managing is segregations of duties. And that's going to be done through that kind of access management piece we talked earlier, through it's AWS's identity access management service. And so ensuring that the individuals that are developing code are not also have full access to the systems they're making code changes for, or have full access to the AWS management console is important here to showing we're implementing segregations of duties in the AWS side of things here. So regarding the availability criteria, backups and replication, the configuration of backups and replications for resources hosted within AWS is the responsibility of the organization. AWS gives the organization the tools and the ability to perform backups and do replication, but ultimately it's the organization's responsibility to ensure those configurations have been implemented according to their needs. So specific to replication, you could have it replicating within the availability zone you're in. So say you're in US East, could have it replicating within that availability zone. But if that availability zone goes down, then you could have some issues with the availability of your solution. Whereas if we're replicating to another AWS region, then if US East goes down, then we could continue on services in US West. Utilizing AWS, you're not going to have that kind of redundancy. It needs to be configured. So and resource utilization is another piece in availability, and that's going to be that can be monitored through CloudWatch, which will pick up how the capacity type controls we'd expect in this criteria. Processing integrity, AWS has lots of solutions for processing information, and a couple of these here. We've got some serverless applications that can be developed within AWS through ECS or EKS. Lambda is another serverless computing solution AWS offers. The key here is, an organization going through a SOC audit would need to know for this is to communicate how we're processing our information to allow auditors, if they're coming in here, to have that context to be able to approach these solutions. So within confidentiality and privacy, AWS has all of its compliance reports situated in a service it calls AWS Artifacts, and individuals with access to the management console for AWS can access their SOC reports, high trust reports, those types of compliance reports, and review those there. Resources within AWS can be configured to automatically delete data using such as a Lambda function. For instance, if we set a resource to be deleted after a certain amount of time, we can have the Lambda code scripted to trigger whenever a resource reaches a certain age, and then the Lambda function will kick off to remove the resource there. Life cycles can also be set up in S3 if that's the solution we're using to kind of automate that deletion of information that may have reached its data retention time period. Tagging resources is an excellent way of identifying resources that may contain or are processing sensitive information. And this can also be tied in with Lambda functions for automatically deleting resources based on certain tags. So it overall helps with the management of confidentiality and privacy. And so with that, this concludes the webinar here on AWS and Your Organization SOC 2 report. We would love to help your organization navigate these challenges and have a successful SOC 2 audit. Please feel free to reach out to myself or our practice leader, Drew Hendrickson, with any questions you might have. You can visit us online at lbmcsecurity.com. Thank you very much.